Politics is more polarised than ever before. My question is, how on earth did we get here? The Memo starts right now. And a very good evening to you. Welcome to The Memo. I'm Kaylem Shepherd. What once used to be a place of healthy debate is now turning into a cesspit of identity and, well, loyalty. And yes, I'm talking about politics. Why is the UK's political system so divided? Why is it so divisive? We've got people on the left and the right basically calling for each other's heads. Is this what politics should be? Or do we all need to come together as one to unite? Surely politics is for the common man. We're all meant to strive together to make our country better. So where has it gone all wrong? And why are we so divided as a nation? Joining me now to discuss more on this is Benjamin Butterworth. Benjamin, you are a journalist and broadcaster. Thank you very much for your time. Benjamin, why is politics so divided?
Because I think that benefits people on the right, for sure. I think in the last few years, we've seen things get very divided. It used to be, when I was growing up and Tony Blair was Prime Minister, politics was all about the centre ground. It was about bringing people together. It was quite predictable. It was kind of formulaic. David Cameron kind of copied Tony Blair. Nick Clegg was in the same vein. And Theresa May tried to find the centre ground. And then we've seen social media change so much, I think. And now it becomes about the people that can shout the loudest, be the angriest, be the most indignant. You saw that with Jeremy Corbyn, you saw it with Boris Johnson and Brexit, you see it with the SNP after their Scottish independence referendum. And
Nigel Farage?
Yeah, Nigel Farage is the best example now. I mean, look, who thinks that Nigel Farage can be Prime Minister? The guy's
Some people do.
Yeah, but I was going to say those people are thick, but that probably won't help the cause. but no, it's seriously, they're a party, Reform UK is a party of grievance, not a party of government. But you've got this...
But they're resonating with young people. I mean, this is a podcast about young...
believe that.
Do you not think so?
No.
Okay,
but
go on.
I was just going to say that you've got into a situation where people shouting the loudest rather than having the most numbers is seen as winning the argument. You know, being able to be the most passionate about the problem rather than being the person being able to explain how you fix the problem. But I actually think that people forget Britain is not America. In America, that stuff goes a lot further. It's more ingrained into their culture.
Yeah.
They've had it for longer. But here, there's a reason Keir Starmer has more than 400 Labour MPs. And it's because we're not that kind of culture. So I think that people that think shouting loudest will get them over the line, get them quite far, but you're never going to form a government.
People such as Nigel Farage, Lee Anderson, what would you say to them? What advice would you give to them to reach young people when it comes to politics?
Well, I'd rather they didn't reach anybody because they're wrong. But I spent this morning with Lee Anderson, in fact, filming something.
Yeah. Nice guy?
Yeah, he's fine. But I think...
What politicians should be?
Well, no, because all he is angry, right? All they do is vent anger and they don't offer solutions. I think that this question about whether Gen Z has become more right-wing, I think has been totally misreported, because if you look at the number of votes the Reform and the Conservatives got together at the last election among under 25s, well, it's the lowest it's been in decades.
Yeah.
The idea they're surging to the right just isn't revealed in the truth. I think it was something like 8 or 9% that Reform got, and I think they beat the Tories. Now, that's not a massive right-wing surge. It's just that there are a few loud, angry people on social media, and they get all the retweets for saying the crazy things. Meanwhile, the rest of them that most likely vote Labour or Liberal Democrat
Don't say anything.
or Green, well, they're just not as exciting as interesting. Yeah. And there's this ready machine in the media.
That's the thing about politics, though, isn't it? It has to be interesting. It has to be engaging. That's why people like Boris Johnson win elections, are so charismatic. Is Keir Starmer that charismatic character that we need in the UK at the moment?
Well, Boris Johnson winning an election didn't go very well. The thing that won Boris Johnson the election is the reason that he was such a terrible Prime Minister, because all he was is a showman. And I think that people saw through that. You know, if a leader is judged on how they behave when they're tested, events, my dear, I think, was that a Churchill quote or somebody else? That's when real leadership shows. And I think there's very little enthusiasm for Keir Starmer. He was just sufficiently competent and calm enough that it got Labour across the line as the Tories were collapsing. But my money, and this is the opposite of the prevailing logic, is that Keir Starmer will come to be a real asset. Because if you look at the last couple of months, when Donald Trump has been wildly unpredictable and dishonest, and the Ukraine war has become more difficult, and relationships with Europe are in such a bad state. And he has stepped up each and every time in a way that nobody anticipated he could. And I think that shows real leadership.
Yeah, how he handled the situation with Donald
It's
Trump
doing
was
it when
incredible.
things go wrong.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'm not sure if anybody has a long and successful relationship with Donald Trump, not even his wives.
Yeah.
But Keir
Melania
Starmer,
doing quite well.
Oh, she looks miserable. Oh, she's only in it. I'm sorry.
Getting the paycheck, you think?
Well, exactly. I mean, look, Melania Trump, let's look at this. She was asked to turn up to his first court hearing and she refused. She didn't turn up to any of the rallies or any of the events. The only time she turned up was when he accepted the Republican nomination, and the terms on which she turned up was that she'd sit in the box, but she didn't want to be with him. I mean, it's just preposterous.
Yeah, it's ridiculous, isn't it?
And I think Melania Trump is the only person in the world Donald Trump is scared of.
You think so?
So, you know, maybe we should get her on side.
Yeah, that'd be quite good, isn't it?
She could save Ukraine.
Save Ukraine? You think so?
Yeah.
think
Well,
so?
she's from Eastern Europe.
There we
for a
go.
start. She's from Slovenia.
Yeah, talking about Melania Trump, I want to move on to immigration. Not that she's, lives in the UK, but do you think politicians
but she got a golden visa to the US for gifted and talented. I don't know what it was she was gifted and talented at, but
wasn't she a model?
Right, but I'm not sure it was intended. I'm not saying model isn't a legitimate job, of course it is, but I don't know if it's meant to skip the whole visa process.
Yeah, let's talk about immigration when it comes to the UK. Do you think people on the far right use immigration as a tool to weaponise politics or cause division?
I mean, they use it as a dog whistle to racial politics. You see this with this guy Rupert Lowe, the sort of Reform UK MP, the one they've kicked out. So he said, and he claims this is part of the disagreement with Nigel Farage, that it's not just immigrants to this country who've committed a crime, but their family members who should be kicked out of the country. Now, if that's not basically racist, I don't know what is. Because if a Muslim man who was born in Bangladesh commits a crime, fair enough, of course he should be kicked out or she should be kicked out.
Yeah.
That seems legitimate to me. But what, their aunt should go? Their 20-year-old son should go? I mean, we don't say that for anybody else. My parents are both prisoners, right? And some of my family are Canadian. What, should I be kicked out because someone I barely even know has committed a crime? And so I think it's a dog whistle to those things, because you see it when Rupert Lowe said kick out all their relatives, which is basically just, kicking out racial and ethnic groups. So many people cheered along, and I think that's alarming. But on the other side, there are lots of people that are just alarmed by the pace of change, which is entirely legitimate. And then they get too awkward because they think, it's all this racial, ethnic, religious stuff. I don't want to talk about it. And then you lend the argument to people like Rupert Lowe or Nigel Farage.
Do you think we should have an open border?
No, of course not. I mean, apparently we do. If you've got a boat, just come on in. And this is the thing: the idea that somehow it's a right-wing argument to say that that you're not really left-wing if you complain about the people coming over in the boats. It's absolutely insane that thousands of people a week on some weeks can just come in at Dover. I mean, that's terrifying, right? Because you don't know who these people are. But the truth is that one of the practical ways to stop that is to have ID cards. Because one of the main pull factors is that we have a massive dodgy economy. People working, not paying taxes. And they come into this country, they can go into that. Sometimes it's slave labour, sometimes it's just making money underground. And if you have ID cards, it makes it a lot harder for them to work in a barber's or in a supposed sweet shop or, in a car wash if they have to show your ID card to the officer when they turn up. So I think we should have ID cards to
You
stop
think
the
so?
boats.
That's I'd say quite controversial. Some people are like, no, not at all.
But it's not, is it? Because if you open your phone, if you want to get on the tube, you show the phone your face. To get in there. If you want to go to a bar or a club, they'll check your ID in some form like that. We're used to it in our day-to-day life. You give that information over 10, 20 times a day if you're under the age of 90. And so, if you could just do that one more time, but it would make it harder for people from Albania to come in. And that's the thing, right? It was the case that the biggest number of people arriving on boats were from Albania. People from Albania could probably get in legitimately, but they weren't because the drug and sex trade in this country is controlled by Albanian gangs. And so they come in illegally so they can work in that. They make an absolute fortune and they then go back to Albania. Well, they're only coming here for crime.
Do you think policies like the Rwanda scheme deter people from coming over?
No, it just encouraged Rwanda to make more money out of Britain. I mean, it's just a nonsense. Like, it was, what, it cost hundreds of millions of pounds.
Priti Patel would say it's a great idea.
The only person we ever sent there was Suella Braverman, which, to be honest, was quite a good start. But unfortunately, she did make her way back. You know, it was ridiculous because you could only have ever sent a handful of people to Rwanda under that scheme. And when you've got 25, 40,000 people coming into the country on the boats, it was never a serious resolution. And the people knew their chances were still good. And frankly, they're risking their lives. People die in the channel. So if they're willing to take in the risk of losing their life, then the risk of being flown to Rwanda, which isn't a horrible country, it's actually quite a prosperous country now, you know, I'm not sure it was a deterrent. If it was, well, Donald Trump says send them to Guantanamo Bay, and it looks like that's a deterrent. I don't agree with it, but it looks like it's reducing numbers.
When it comes to policy, do you think enough people or young people are engaged on the policy side of politics?
Well, I guess it's that question of, like, what is politics, right? Because lots of people, the word is really off-putting. The word policy is even less sexy than the word politics. But if you ask them about their lives and their hopes and the cost of university or the cost of housing if they're starting off in their adult lives, they'll recognise all those things are often quite unfair, quite expensive, quite inaccessible. And so I think that's when it resonates with people. But then you also get into these sort of crazy discussions about international affairs, which, you know, doesn't affect anybody's life. And I think people at universities, I never thought about Israel-Palestine in my life. I don't think I could have.
It's all over university campuses at the moment.
Right. And when I was at the LSE some years ago as a student, and people would talk about that, and I was like, I don't know where these countries are. Like, it means nothing to me. But you get these people that get obsessed with it, and then think that all young people are, and I don't think that's the case at all.
I was watching your speech that you gave to the Oxford Union.
Oh, it's terrible.
You think so?
I've only watched it back once. But
it was on free speech. Do you think we've now allowed speech to become somewhat hatred, and people are getting away with it and passing it off as free speech? Because you've had some critics when it comes to your thoughts on your ideologies on free speech.
I mean, I was raised by my grandparents, and I find it amazing the amount of people that just are rude, and then they pass that off and say, well, it's free speech. Okay, I guess it is, but I think some good British politeness should have stopped people saying some of the things they say. Like the way they talk about trans people is disgusting. You know, you don't necessarily have to agree with the same conclusions of what the laws should be, but the fact that people will call trans women a man and then, you know, revel in the fact they've said it. I mean, that's just bullying. That's just nasty. And I think there's no such thing as free speech, in my view, because there is no utopia in which everyone gets to express their views fully, freely. Because, you know, if one person legitimately thinks that being gay is disgusting, well, does that mean that they can shout it at a person that they believe is gay in the street? Well, they could say that's their free speech because they sincerely believe it.
So would you say that's hate speech?
Of course it is, because it's taking away the right of the person on the receiving end of that kind of speech to go about their normal lives. Right? And so that person doesn't have any freedom if they're abused by the other person. You know, do you have a right to shout fire in a crowded theatre when there's no fire? Well, that causes carnage. It causes chaos. It's pointless. It costs money to the theatre and to the state to deal with. Right? And I think at the moment you have a lot of people that just want to wind others up and call it free speech. And I think they should know better.
You mentioned the trans issue. I watched your interview with Piers Morgan. You called him Pingu Morgan.
I did.
Does he not have a right to be Pingu Morgan?
Well, that's because I'm very witty. That he said he identified as a penguin, and I said, "Well, Pingu Morgan."
I thought that was quite good.
It was actually,
I liked it.
It was on the second interview that I came up with that, so it took me about a month. But well, I tell you what, that Piers Morgan interview about whether there's 100 genders and how people can identify.
Do you still stand by that? There is 100 genders.
Well, inflation's very high, so there's 110 now. But, I tell you, that interview follows me around the world.
It's done really well online.
I mean, it's got
incredibly well.
Tens of millions of views across different platforms. And until relatively recently, it was constantly going viral again and again and again. I was in a camel restaurant in Muscat in Oman, and I was paying for my camel, and the man behind didn't speak much English, but he said, are you on YouTube? And I said, well, sort of. You know, they put these things on YouTube. And then he said, my son recognized you. So the Pingu story made it all the way to Muscat in a camel restaurant.
Yeah.
I should add that the camel restaurant, you eat the dead camels. You don't just sort of buy a camel.
Take it away.
So yeah, that lives with me forever. It's had tens of millions of views. But the question was, can people use words to explain their own identity?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. I mean, David Bowie was non-binary. The term didn't exist, but he described himself in words to that effect 30, 40 years ago. It's not new.
So Piers Morgan can be Pingu Morgan, and you can accept it.
Well, Piers Morgan's totally wrong, obviously.
Why?
Because he thinks that everyone has to fit into a box because that's how he understands the world. You know, in the late 90s, there was a magazine front cover, I forget which one, it may have been Time magazine, that said bisexuals, the new sexuality. Well, I mean, that's just absurd now, right? Those people, it was always a spectrum.
Yeah. And
so if we understand that sexuality is a spectrum, that hair colour is a spectrum, that face colour is a spectrum, that, you know, skin colour, that your mind is a spectrum. Some people are more intelligent than others naturally. Or,
Clearly.
Know, or, yeah, exactly. I'm less. But,
no.
You know, autism is a spectrum. We understand all these other things are a spectrum because human beings are not on a binary. And then it gets to gender and we say, well, that there couldn't possibly be people in the middle, you know, these crazy wokes trying to overturn the world. Why would it be that every other aspect of our humanity is on a spectrum, but gender wouldn't be?
Do you think
it doesn't
sex
make
is?
Any sense? Well, gender, well, I guess that's what I'm
Yeah.
sex. Well, some people are biologically in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Because they're born with neither parts naturally. But you know that people's natural levels of things like estrogen can vary significantly, even if they have male or female parts. But the mind, we know that gender is a spectrum. If it's not, why do all these people in all these parts of the world throughout history exist on that spectrum and express being transgender or things like that for hundreds, if not thousands of years in history books and diaries of people? Are they all making it up? You know, were they all brainwashed by some BBC video like Piers Morgan would claim? Of course they weren't, right? Gender is a spectrum, and, you know, if only compassion were on a spectrum where more people were more compassionate.
India Willoughby says that you put a bad label on trans, trans.
Yeah, but India Willoughby can't make her mind up because back in those interviews on Good Morning Britain, she hated everything I said, and now she would say I'm some kind of crazy right-winger, and she says everything I used to say.
Yeah.
So, you know, I felt uncomfortable being on air with India Willoughby because I wasn't sure how happy she was to be there.
Yeah. So do you think it was all clickbaity then?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, that's not. But then we're talking about, you know, this is people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty crazy because that thing, like several of those interviews, trended #1 worldwide on Twitter, and I remember before the 100 Genders interview, a producer at ITV had taken me to one side and said, "Don't worry, he won't test you on this list that had been produced by Facebook at the time of how you could identify." And I said, "Oh, good." Then we get on set, and the first thing Piers Morgan says is like, "What is a two-binary?" Something I can't remember. Two-spirit penguin, that was it. And I was like, Piers,
calm down.
You don't have to be an expert in this, right?
Yeah.
You know, there are loads of diseases and you know, oddities of the human being that I can't name or explain, but it doesn't mean they don't exist.
Yeah, no, it's
right?
true.
And so they tried to trip me up in that way, but you know, it went viral. It made ITV some money from 12 million views on YouTube.
Did it make you any?
Made me 150 quid, I think. And it now lives with me forever. So,
what challenges do you think the LGBT community face in politics at the moment?
Well, Russell T Davies, who wrote a program called Queer as Folk, but currently is the lead writer on Doctor Who, a very famous gay writer, he said, and he's in his 60s, that he doesn't think things have been so bad for gay people since the AIDS crisis and the bigotry that was released after that. And I do think those gay people, and there aren't many, but there are some, that celebrate the anti-trans attitude should be careful what they wish for, because those people are coming after you. You know, there are people that say that gay men or gay women shouldn't be allowed to adopt. That's the next stage that they're going for. You know, this nasty implication that somehow being gay is linked to being a paedophile. It still lingers. I think in politics...
But we see a load... Well, we don't see loads of gay MPs, but come on, behind the scenes, they're
all
doing
gay.
quite, you know...
They're all gay, yeah, 100%. No, I mean, well, you've got Wes Streeting in the cabinet, who is engaged to a man, so that's pretty indicative. And I've known him a bit since I was a teenager. And he's one of the most charming and popular members of the government. I think it's entirely plausible that he could be prime minister. In the US, you've got Pete Buttigieg, who is a Harvard-educated Iraq veteran that was transport secretary under Joe Biden. I think it's plausible that in 5 years' time, God forbid dear Keir Starmer should no longer be prime minister, but it will come to an end eventually. But in 5 to 10 years' time, you could have both the US and the UK run by gay men in Pete Buttigieg and Wes Streeting.
You think so?
I would say they're the favourites on both sides of the Atlantic to be the successor prime minister to the incumbent leaders.
Why do you think there's still this kind of hostility towards gay people within Parliament?
I don't think there is in Parliament.
Do you not think so?
No, I don't think it really crops up. I mean, a massively disproportionate number are now, certainly on the Labour benches, are LGBT. But there's never, I say LGBT, there's never been a transgender person in Parliament. And look at the challenge that Susie Izzard, who goes by either Eddie or Susie Izzard, at the challenges they faced when putting themselves forward to be a Labour candidate. They were ridiculed and mocked. A transgender person trying to run for Parliament of any party would be heavily undermined, and people would obsess over their gender identity instead of what they say. And so I think it'd be very difficult. I think it's got worse for transgender people, without doubt, because there's this obsession over their lives. When I was growing up, the Gender Recognition Act, which allowed you to change your gender, your sex on your birth certificate, had just been passed in 2004, 5, 6. And a woman called Nadia won Big Brother. She was transgender, and she won in a landslide. And it was kind of accepted. So how could that happen in the mid-noughties? But 20 years later, now, if anyone tries to have a prominent career, it doesn't matter what they're saying. It matters, apparently, about how they identify and what physical parts they do or don't have.
But look at Caitlyn Jenner. She's been quite successful.
I try not to look at Caitlyn Jenner.
Why not?
Well, she's foul. I mean,
she's trans?
Right. But here's the point: being
Isn't she
trans,
a champion of trans?
Being trans isn't the pertinent part. It's about whether you're a good human or not. That ought to be what a meritocratic society looks like. And I mean, Caitlyn Jenner is despised by LGBT people. She's about as good at politics as she is at driving. Crashes everything. She is somebody who constantly advocates for Donald Trump. A hateful bigot that will gladly take away the rights of all minorities and doesn't give a damn what happens. So
I think there was something going on in America with them trying to remove the word gay from
women called gay have been removed from records,
planes as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
it's just hate-fueled, and Caitlyn Jenner supports that. So there's a reason she's not invited to events anymore.
Yeah. How did your political kind of activism start?
Well, I went to LSE. Well, to be honest...
You're not an activist, you'd say.
Well, I'm a journalist, but...
Journalist, broadcaster.
Icon, thought leader.
There we go.
A variety
all-round nice guy.
Wouldn't go that far. I loved Tony Blair growing up. And I was raised by my grandparents, largely. My parents were both in prison for various crimes. And I went to a state comprehensive school. And I think I saw, a prime minister that, as far as I was concerned, was saying it's okay to be gay and you should be able to come from any background to achieve anything. And that really resonated with me. And then I got into the LSE. I got involved in Labour students and did some work in Parliament, 1 day a week for a Member of Parliament. And it went from there. And then I ended up running part of the Labour Party's youth wing later on and built my journalism career from there. But I think it felt quite innate because, I don't know, maybe I'm political in the first place. But I think anybody that's from some kind of minority group knows what it's like for the system to not work and for the world around you to feel like it's structured in a way that isn't fair and equal.
What didn't work for you?
Well, as a gay person, especially 20 years ago, being bullied at school for being gay and still a whole host of laws on the statute book that meant, you could be sacked at work for being gay. You certainly couldn't get married. All those kind of things. I'm a teenager at this point, but you're growing up in an atmosphere where that's changing, and you ask, why is it changing? Well, because people got into government to change it. And so then you see the value of politics. And all these things can be turned backwards. We're seeing that in the US. There is a majority on the Supreme Court of the United States that could undo same-sex marriage in the US. It's a case of if or when such a case makes it to the Supreme Court, but it's entirely plausible that would be undone if it made it there. And I don't think that's going to happen here, but there are people that would like to do that. You know, if Reform were to form a government, there's no way they would not get rid of the Equality Act. Of course they would. And that would mean that you could be sacked at work for being gay or for being black or for being disabled, right? They'd definitely get rid of that. And they'd dress it up as something else, as meritocracy. You know, they would say you shouldn't have special rules for minority groups. But fine, but there's special targeting of minority groups. Of course there is. There's prejudice.
What advice would you give to someone who wants to get into politics?
Don't. No, that's just.
We need more young people in politics.
That's my great sense of humour.
There you go. That Piers didn't understand.
Yes, exactly. Well, Piers did understand because we got along quite well actually afterwards.
Have you been on his new show?
I was invited many times when it launched, but I had a contract with another channel, so I couldn't.
We're going to get to your channel in a moment.
And then I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago actually.
How's he doing?
I mean, it wasn't such an informative chat.
Okay.
I was taking off on a flight, so it wasn't very useful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would gladly do it. I would gladly be on his show to tell him why he's wrong about everything.
Yeah.
What was your question?
How do we get more young people involved in politics?
Well, I guess it's about the questions that affect them, right? Like, you know, whether it's tuition fees or the cost of housing. If they think those things can be affected, then they'll get more involved. Yeah. But politics is dominated by older people who have the houses, who have the money, who have the advantages. And, you know, that's going to be the case if other people don't get involved and don't change those structures. But the Labour Party is pretty young. I reckon the average age of a newly elected Labour MP at the last election must be in the mid-30s, if not low 30s. So that's a radical change.
Yeah, I think it was the youngest MP in Parliament. His name was Keir something, wasn't he?
Yes, Keir Mather.
Yeah,
I know. Yeah,
I knew him on the podcast.
I knew him from.
Declined it. Yeah.
I knew him from Young Labour.
Did you? How was he?
And he was younger than me.
Nice guy.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah.
I think he wanted to be a member of Parliament, and he succeeded. So,
do you think he's going to bring change to Parliament?
I think he's quite quiet, to be honest, which maybe is why he didn't do a podcast.
Yeah.
But you know, it's very impressive, and he had the biggest swing in history, 20,000 Tory majority he overturned, and he kept it at the general election. So that shows how hated the Tories are. And if Kemi Badenoch thinks, you know, getting rid of net zero targets is going to fix that, she's wrong.
Yeah. So politics is quite, going back to our topic of the conversation. Politics is divisive in itself. How do we get rid of it?
Get rid of politics.
Get rid of the divisiveness in politics.
Yeah, get rid of politics. That's what Donald Trump would do.
There you go.
Well, people don't want to get rid of it, right? Because it benefits the extremes. You've got the hard left, the people that supported a dangerous anti-Semite like Jeremy Corbyn, that revelled in attacking people. If you're not with them, you're against them, the purity tests. And then you've got these people online with Reform. Yeah. Well, I say you've got these people online with Reform UK. They're not real people. They're fake, okay? I was on a programme with Nigel Farage on Tuesday. And he said all these accounts supporting this Rupert Lowe guy, they were created 2 years ago, in the last 2 years. They're not real. And so I think what you've got is social media, specifically Twitter, or X, as its weird owner calls it. And what they want to do is, there's more money in selling lies than there is the truth, because the truth is nuanced and complicated and not necessarily sexy, and saying everything's a conspiracy and an outrage sells. You know, Russell Brand earlier today tweeted that the guy that's known to have murdered JFK wasn't him, and actually it was Penelope Keith, right, who's a sort of 75-year-old British actress. It was completely absurd. Now, he deleted it, but this fake screenshot that was shared had gone around the world and made those people all sorts of money. Making stuff up makes money on the internet now.
So do you think social media companies need to be a bit more...
Yeah, but they're not going to.
Held to account.
But they're going to do the opposite, because that makes them more money, more interaction, more outrage.
We saw all of them turn up to President Trump's...
If I screamed at you some swear words and stormed off and you clipped that up, do you think it would get more viewings and come up in more people's For You page than if I sat here and had a nuanced discussion? We know the answer.
Yeah.
But that's dangerous.
So do you not think governments can put their foot down?
I can do that, though, if you want.
Do you want to? There you go. Do you think governments really do need to put their foot down, though, when it comes to social media companies?
Well,
we saw all of them at Trump's inauguration.
Exactly. And that's why I think they're hooked into Trump because they were scared. They knew that regulation was a big threat to their business model, if not a benefit to humanity. And they found a guy with no principles and no morals who thinks that actually, if I team up with these people that have platforms bigger than any newspaper magnate could have ever dreamed, well, then I can control the access to information the world over. Twitter is a ridiculous place. All the arguments, anything I tweet, I get loads of people, none of whom have human faces as their picture.
Bots.
Yeah, exactly. Now, no one has ever said the things these people say on Twitter applies in real life. It's not the real world, but it's distorting it. And I think a lot of it comes down to Russia as well, which, floods the internet with these fake voices.
You on Blue Sky?
What's that?
It's this new social media app that everyone's using. Apparently it's meant to be the safe haven for the lefties.
Oh, well, I don't want a safe haven.
You don't want a safe haven?
No, if I did, I wouldn't be on GB News.
We're going to talk about GB News, actually. Would you say they contribute in fueling division in our political system?
Well, I suppose so.
So why'd you do it?
Well, some people there put emphatic views, but look, it exists and it's well watched. It keeps beating Sky News. And I think that this idea that if you just don't engage with people and you don't listen to them and you don't have the debate, that somehow that gives you moral superiority and solves anything is just total nonsense. It doesn't, right? If I weren't doing it, other people would be doing it and they'd be getting the money, which is even worse.
So you're doing it for the money?
No, I'm not doing it for the money. But
You got a message. But
but if other people that were rubbish were doing it, I don't think that would make me any happier.
Yeah.
And if you look back at the last 10 years, was ignoring people like Nigel Farage and demeaning him, did that achieve anything? Well, no, he just got more powerful.
They're not laughing now, are they?
No.
Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage is often laughing.
Yeah.
And so I think, you have to have the debate.
Yeah.
And also, I've been there since launch night, and there are lots of very nice people there and people that I enjoy working
But
with.
you think there's room for GB News in our current political
Well, it's a market
sphere.
economy, right? And there's clearly a market for it. I think its financial intake is up significantly. Its audience, it's got almost 2 million subscribers on YouTube, and so I think it's well worth engaging with. But of course, a channel like that wants to emphasize divisions and differences because that's where it finds its place in the market. But there are lots of places that do that. That's not new in British media. The Daily Mail or the Daily Express or whatever, or what's that lefty newspaper? The really hard left one? I can't think of its name. That's how successful it is. The Morning Star.
Okay.
Those places do that all the time.
Never heard of them.
It's not new. It's just filmed rather than written.
Yeah. Benjamin, you gonna say something?
Kaylem.
Say something. What are you gonna say?
I wasn't going to say.
You're gonna say something.
I was just breathing.
Who are you? Who would you say you are as a person? What do you stand for?
I don't know.
Why should we listen to you on television?
Why? Who am I?
Yeah.
Is this like therapy?
Yeah, why not? Should we sit down and get comfortable?
Who am I? I don't know the answer to that. Who are you?
I'm Kaylem Shepherd, journalist, broadcaster, not broadcaster, but journalist. Podcaster. Well, what makes you you? Why would someone want to listen to you on television?
Well, a lot of people, I get lots of tweets saying like, who's that? Can I swear? I can't.
Yeah, it's a podcast.
Who's that posh twat?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not posh for a start, but like that's the perception they get. So like very middle class. And I mean, I was born in a council estate and both my parents were in prison and my dad has been convicted of drug dealing and all sorts of violence. My mother's been convicted of drug dealing. And I came from that background and made it through. And so I think that gave me an insight into the world to see two very different worlds. Because then I was taken in by my grandparents and I lived in Alderley Edge, which is rather like, it's like the Barnes of Manchester.
Yeah.
It's very posh.
Yes.
Let's say the
Where the
Chelsea.
footballers live.
It's the Chelsea of Manchester.
Yeah.
And so I saw those two very different worlds. And I think that gives you an education and maybe even a small amount of wisdom. And that's what's motivated me is to talk about that. And I think also when you've been in an environment with sort of violent parents and parents that have been to prison, you feel so vulnerable and you have no power in that situation. And so I think the reason I wanted to be a journalist and to be on television was because that is a form of power. That is a way to tell other people's stories and to tell your story and to try and change attitudes.
Benjamin, really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on The Memo.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for watching and listening. The Memo is back soon. Take care. I'm Kaylem Shepherd. Thank you very much for hitting that like and subscribe button. Remember, you can get notifications wherever you are in the world. Please, just subscribe, just for me.